All right, can everyone see the shared PowerPoint? Okay, perfect. All right, well, we will get started. So I guess as Zoom host, introducing myself, Gillian Harper, and Makeda Henry, will be doing workplace isolation talk. So yeah, really happy to have this conversation about social isolation with a focus on the workplace. It's a common experience, and we're looking forward to diving in with some insights. Hopefully you can take some of these strategies for building connection in the workplace back to your own workplaces, but also during the hackathon, there could be ways of sort of applying what we learn about social isolation and connection in the workplace and how that could be applied to a larger community, maybe of Vancouver, or if you're focusing in on a specific area during the hackathon. All right, so my name is Gillian Harper, and I'm an organizational development consultant at Realize Strategies, as well as a senior instructor for Realize U. My background is in organizational psychology. I have a CPHR designation, and I'm also certified in Hogan and Dennison leadership and culture assessments. So Realize Strategies is a boutique B Corp certified consulting firm. We specialize in employee experience and culture, organizational design, and change management. And we recently launched Realize U, which is our digital education platform designed to help leaders think innovatively and approach change with resilience and nimbleness. So I'll pass it over to my colleague, Makeda, to introduce herself. I can't hear you, Makeda. Can others hear Makeda? No.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, that's perfect. So thanks, Gillian. Yeah, so my name is Makeda Henry. I am also an organizational development consultant here at Realize Strategies, also a senior instructor for Realize U. So my background is in industrial organizational psychology, and I am a ProSci certified change management practitioner. So both Gillian and I are very passionate about workplace topics such as these, since it really does largely impact our life outside of work and how we're able to show up. And so today we'll be spending the next 20 minutes or so covering what is social isolation in the workplace, the importance of workplace connection, looking at some research in this area, and then looking at causes, impacts, and ways to tackle workplace isolation. We'll also do a short activity at the end, and then we're going to leave a few minutes for questions. So please hold until then, or feel free to send them in the chat. And so now the big question of what is social isolation in the workplace? So it is perceived beliefs and feelings of being isolated from the organization as well as coworkers. And these perceptions come from a lack of support from coworkers and supervisors, as well as a lack of opportunities for social and emotional interactions with the team. So something that's important to note is that being physically isolated, such as working remotely, doesn't equate to social isolation, and that's why the definition is very specific to perceived feelings and beliefs. So you can feel socially isolated in the workplace, even in the continuous physical presence of your team. And so one of the major reasons why workplace social isolation has become a significant topic is because of the new workplace that we are dealing with right now. Many organizations in Canada are primarily remote or have a hybrid model, and about 19% are remote or 6% are hybrid. And so even though being physically isolated does not mean that we are socially isolated, being physically isolated can be a catalyst to these perceptions when we aren't placing enough efforts on creating meaningful connections and interactions, which we'll actually speak a little bit more about soon. And so I'm going to pass on to Gillian to talk more about why workplace connection is important.
All right. So one of the reasons we are talking about this topic is because workplace connection is key to avoiding feelings of isolation. So friendships and social interactions are basic psychological requirements for human well-being, and we spend a huge portion of our lives in our workplaces. So ensuring those social interaction needs are met at work will help benefit people both at work and outside of work. So connections at work create supportive and collaborative environments. Building interpersonal relationships at work allows people to feel more comfortable asking for support when needed and collaborating more effectively. And then this in turn helps improve those connections. So it's often a positive feedback loop. Our own research on the employee experience has also found that higher levels of manager and coworker support are highly related to reduced levels of burnout. So having a supportive social connection at work can help protect people from potential burnout. And you can kind of see how that might extrapolate out to sort of in the community as well. So workplace connection is also important because how people connect with each other at work is changing due to hybrid and remote work. So in some workplaces, the ability to eat lunch together or chat while making tea helped create those feelings of social connection at work without really needing much effort at all. And so then the introduction of remote work or hybrid work impacted the ability to have those informal connections, or sort of the water cooler chats, as people would often call them. So we're going to dive into some of the research. So it's important first to emphasize that social isolation and loneliness aren't exactly the same. They're definitely often used interchangeably, especially in a city such as Vancouver, where these feelings are definitely expressed. And while they're related, they are different. So workplace social isolation refers to those, again, those perceived feelings and beliefs of a lack of connection to a person's organization and team, whereas loneliness is more about the depth and quality of relationships. So you could have a ton of relationships, but if there's not that meaningfulness with them, then you'd be feeling more lonely still. So in terms of the research on workplace isolation, they found 5 dimensions. So the first is social support isolation. So this is a lack of support from peers, supervisors, or the organization as a whole. Social interaction isolation is a lack of informal, social, and emotional interaction or deficient social networks. Professional learning opportunity isolation. So that would be a lack of information or a lack of opportunity to learn. And related to that one, professional growth isolation, where there's a lack of opportunity for professional advancement. And then finally, there is also physical isolation, which is fairly self-explanatory. So understanding these 5 different dimensions will allow individuals or leaders to focus in on specific areas of change in order to reduce those feelings of workplace isolation and help create better connections. Okay, so in terms of causes, there's quite a few different ones that cause workplace social isolation. So the first is the company culture. There could be differences in work styles or work ethics. There could be a lack of psychological safety that's maybe preventing people from bringing their authentic selves to work and then being able to really connect on that real level. Another cause could be cliques and social groups. So there could be groups that are purposefully excluding others. There could be insufficient integration of new hires. There could be concentrations of, say, different age groups that are maybe struggling to connect with each other. And so this feeling of a lack of meaningful conversations and trust with coworkers can lead to those feelings of workplace isolation. There's also demographics. So diversity in a workplace does not work without inclusion. Those need to be going hand in hand. So without inclusion, those who are in our minority groups in terms of race, age, experience, or other areas are likely to feel a lack of belonging unless there's purposeful effort at fostering the inclusion. Work setup is another cause. So if there's role ambiguity or overload, having different work schedules, siloed teams, again, sort of the remote and hybrid work, disconnecting people. And especially with hybrid and remote setups, it can be really hard for those to, if some people are in person and some are joining remotely, you can have definitely feelings of isolation as the person who's remote, especially if multiple conversations start happening in person. And then finally, personal stressors. So, as much as we'd like to separate our work and personal lives, sometimes can't really properly do that. And so sometimes what happens is when those life stressors around finances or housing or relationships, they can spill into work life and either cause someone to feel more isolated or kind of isolate themselves without realizing it just because of what's going on. So I'll pass it back to Makeda to talk about some of the impacts.
Thank you, Gillian. So workplace social isolation is important and it's a cause for concern, especially because it has negative impacts when the levels are high. And so it does impact 3 areas that we have here. And one of those is the employee experience. So when people are feeling socially isolated at work, they're likely to have reduced job satisfaction, low organizational commitment, as well as high turnover intentions. And then these can have a ripple effect affecting other employees and the organization as a whole. It also affects performance. So it can reduce our motivation because of the disconnect that we have between us and the organization, which can then lead to low job involvement and lowered performance. And then it can also affect business metrics, resulting in lowered organizational effectiveness as well. And then lastly is that it does impact our mood. So when we're feeling socially isolated, we may experience feelings of depression as it is highly tied to social connections. And we may also have low self-efficacy and increased stress, anxiety, and burnout as well. But the good news is that there are many ways to tackle workplace social isolation. We have done these into 3 areas, and they kind of connect back to the 5 dimensions of social isolation that Gillian had talked about. But we want to note firstly that as individuals that we do play a role in making others feel welcome and that they belong. Many times we feel like we're the only ones who are experiencing social isolation, but we aren't. So it's important for us to reach out to others and check in with them. And so our first category is fostering connections and belonging. People tend to bond through shared experiences. Sometimes it might be negative, such as going through a tough situation together, and it might also be through positive experiences. And so some ways that we can foster those connections are by creating interactive opportunities for friendships to blossom. Gallup had done some research and found that having a best friend at work increases engagement and job success. And so when emphasis is placed on providing opportunities for friendships, it can be helpful in reducing social isolation at work. We can also create opportunities for casual conversations, such as team chats for recipes, having pet photos, having a break room helps. Also maybe an online activity group that's based on interests of sports. At team meetings, you can also use icebreakers that allows people to get to know people more personally. So maybe asking about their weekend or something that they might be looking forward to. And then next is that ensuring that people can be their authentic selves at work by having a psychologically safe culture. For me, this looks like not necessarily being stringent on dress codes, encouraging people to use the languages that they speak without questioning them, as well as ensuring that people are aware of microaggressions. You can also celebrate birthdays, celebrate accomplishments or recognizing them, and celebrating successes as well. Create opportunities for cross-functional teams, so that refers more to the silos that often happens, so that people can get to know each other in the organization through a shared project or committee. And lastly is fostering camaraderie by doing some team volunteering work in the community and ideally during work hours. And so for this, employees at all levels should make a concerted effort to get to know their coworkers and maintain friendships and connections. Sometimes it might mean stepping outside of the office to have walks, have lunch, have happy hours. It might also mean being online and using emojis or GIFs or GIFs that represent who you are as a person and allows you to operate more as your authentic self. And one of the pieces that I would say is also important is respecting other people's boundaries when it comes to those social connections and ensuring that there is a balance for me time, because we also all need to feel like our best selves to be able to show up for others. And so the onus is not just on employees, it's also on leaders to exemplify intentionality in forming connections throughout the organization by practicing some of the things that were just mentioned. So our second category is checking in. So checking in also happens at all levels of the organization. Sometimes when we're working in larger and more dispersed organizations, it's easy to feel disconnected. And so we strongly encourage people from all levels, from everywhere, to check in with each other. And one way that you can do this is by checking on how people are doing as humans, rather than just as an employee. So you might be able to early by regularly checking in with each other and being able to notice when someone starts to sort of seem a little bit different than usual. And an example of this might be that you might find that someone starts to physically isolate the more they feel socially isolated to protect themselves. And so this is a great point to check in and ask, how are you finding things here? Or just asking, how are you? And another way to do this is by setting the example of saying hello and goodbye to people when arriving and leaving the workplace, or if you're online, send something that exemplifies you. And I'd also emphasize to do this on your own terms and again, being authentic in your communication, sometimes without even explanation. And I'll give you an example of this is that I'm from Jamaica. In Jamaica, whenever we're saying hello, depending on the time of the day, we might say good morning, good afternoon, good night, rather than saying hello. And then lastly is that remembering that people all have different needs. So check in with them individually about what they need at the workplace. So again, we are encouraging leaders to do those check-ins. So doing that weekly, monthly as well, just to find out how they can be of best support to their staff. And then our last category is building an inclusive culture. So it's very easy for us to be disconnected from our workplace and the people that we work with. We all have different values, different perspectives, different way of doing things, different backgrounds. We all look different and we do belong to different groups. And these differences often can make us feel like an outsider from the get-go. And so when we have an inclusive culture, it can help to reduce those feelings. And so the first way to do this, which we've mentioned several times over, is by building psychological safety to allow people to bring their authentic selves to work. So it's welcoming people as they are, being curious, celebrating those differences that make them that way. You can also center on the organization's values. So many of us choose to work with an organization because there is an alignment between theirs as well as the company's values. And so if in your workplace, you can center on values, you can do an activity that exemplifies who everyone is. For us at Realize, it's creativity. So if creativity is a value for you, ensure that people get time to be creative together. The next is addressing team or department silos by ensuring that people are able to collaborate across the organization. It also involves keeping information flowing in all directions to everyone and that there is two-way communication. And lastly is encouraging acts of kindness with people at work, whatever that looks like to each person, really. I know that was a lot of information.
All right. So we wanted to, before we got to any questions you might have, just give you the opportunity to ideate on how you might make changes in your organization in terms of reducing social isolation and increasing connection. So using some of the information we've shared today, we'd like you to think about how you might tackle social isolation in your workplace. So we want to give you a few minutes to look at the questions on the screen and just think about maybe an example of something that you might do to to make things a little bit more connected at your workplace. So either reflect on that and answer those questions, or also think about how some of these items could be kind of extrapolated out to a larger community rather than just within the workplace. So we'll give you a few minutes there. We'd love you to share any thoughts you have related to that in the chat. And then we'll get to some questions. All right, so we've got a few people putting things in the chat, sharing some great examples about how they've fostered connection through the pandemic and some other ways that they could maybe improve on that. So definitely recommend reading through those comments. All right. We'll just sort of close up and see if there's any other questions. So before we get to questions, we did just want to share some of our upcoming Realize You courses that we feel might be relevant to building stronger workplace connections. So next week on October 4th, Makeda and I will be leading a workshop on adapting leadership with a focus on managing in a hybrid workplace and strategies to overcome some of the challenges that come with that. Then on October 18th, the two of us are leading a workshop on enhancing your organizational culture through the lens of our Realize Employee Experience framework. And that framework has a quadrant completely dedicated to coworker support, manager support, and inclusion. And then finally, on November 1st, Makeda and our colleague Allison will be leading a workshop on respectful conversations, which is really key to creating a supportive culture